Chapter 1. Introduction to the Court Trials of the Middle Ages. The judiciary in the Middle Ages was a mirror of the social order, the balance of power, and the cultural ideas of right and wrong. Unlike in the modern legal system, medieval court proceedings were not based on uniform legal codes, but on a complex network of local customs, royal decrees, ecclesiastical regulations, and knightly codes of honor. The proceedings were strongly influenced by social status, gender, religion, and economic power. Those who belonged to the ruling class experienced different treatment than a simple farmer or craftsman. The rank of the accused also influenced the course of the trial. Nobles were often granted lenient procedures, while ordinary citizens were punished much more severely. Most medieval court cases originated in local communities. Village communities and town guilds often set up their own courts to settle disputes between members, settle ownership issues, or punish violations of community rules. These local courts were often informal, and decisions were made according to the level of justice that the community felt was appropriate. Both witness statements and the social position of those involved played a decisive role. Authority often lay with the village chief, councils of elders, or local officials, whose verdict was not always formally codified but was respected by those involved. At a higher level, there were royal or princely courts that dealt with more serious offenses or conflicts between different regions. These courts were more formalized and were based on royal or ducal decrees. However, access to these courts was often dependent on personal relationships, political alliances, or financial resources, as fees were charged for certain proceedings or lawyers and representatives were required to formulate the interests of the parties. The trials were therefore not only legal but also political and social power games. The Church played a special role in the medieval legal system. Ecclesiastical courts mainly dealt with violations of church norms, marriage and sexual punishments, disputes between clergy, and cases of heresy. Church jurisdiction was highly ritualized and oriented towards canon law, which was interpreted by theologians and church lawyers. Church trials often had moral dimensions, as sin, penance, and public penances were central components of the process. A convicted person could receive not only secular punishments but also spiritual sanctions, such as excommunication or the obligation to make pilgrimages, which greatly influenced his reputation and social position. A characteristic of medieval court proceedings was the high value of witness testimony and oaths. Since written evidence was rare and documents were expensive or unreliable, the credibility of those involved became crucial. Taking an oath and breaking an oath were central elements. Defendants often had to swear their oath to saints, relics, or the Bible in order to confirm their statements. A broken oath could serve as proof of guilt and often led to severe punishments. In this way, religion was closely linked to legal proceedings, and the idea of divine justice permeated every aspect of the court. Another special feature were the so-called divine judgments. In serious or complicated cases where neither witness testimony nor circumstantial evidence provided clear results, judges could resort to supernatural examinations. These included trials by fire, water, or other trials in which the outcome was interpreted as divine judgment. It was believed that God would punish the guilty and protect the innocent. These trials seemed arbitrary and cruel to today's eyes, but they reflected a deep-rooted idea that human justice was incomplete without divine help. The trial itself was usually public. Villagers, citizens, or simple farmers often took part in court hearings, whether out of curiosity, to maintain social order, or as witnesses. This gave the trials a strong social dimension. They served not only to prosecute but also to demonstrate power and authority. The punishments were often carried out in public in order to cause deterrence and stabilize social norms. The range of punishments ranged from fines and corporal punishment to imprisonment, exile, or, in extreme cases, execution. The choice of punishment depended on the severity of the offense, the social status of the accused, local customs, and the arbitrary of the judges. In many cases, the punishments also reflected social hierarchies, with the lower classes being hit much harder than the privileged classes. The court trials of the Middle Ages are thus a complex interplay of law, religion, power, and society. They were characterized by a deep distrust of written evidence, a strong reliance on testimony, oaths, and divine interventions, and at the same time, they reflected the social structures and political power relations of the time. Each trial was both a legal procedure and a mirror of the medieval world, its ideas of justice, sin, and social order. Chapter 2. Judicial Hierarchies and Institutions in the Middle Ages. The structure of the judiciary in the Middle Ages was closely linked to the hierarchical order of society. Jurisprudence reflected the status, position of power, and political affiliation of those involved. In each region, there was a complex system of courts that included both local and super-regional instances. At the lowest level were village or local courts, which were often presided over by the local official or council of elders. These courts dealt with minor disputes, such as property issues, agricultural conflicts, or neighborhood disputes, and primarily served to maintain social order within the community. The decisions were strongly influenced by local customs and often less formalized than in higher instances, but reflected the village community's ideas of justice. Above these local courts were the municipal and territorial courts, which were often controlled by dukes, counts, or officials appointed by the crown. In cities such as Cologne, Florence, or Paris, urban courts developed, which not only regulated local conflicts, but were also responsible for enforcing commercial law and city ordinances. These courts were organized in a more complex way and had their own protocols, testimonies, and registers in which proceedings and decisions were recorded. At the same time, they served to demonstrate power and order. Those who had access to these courts were dependent on their social position, political connections, or financial means. The highest level of jurisdiction was formed by royal, ducal, or imperial courts, which made decisions beyond regional borders. They were responsible for capital crimes, high treason, major property disputes, and disputes between nobles. These courts functioned not only as legal institutions, but also as political instruments. Kings or emperors could assert their authority here, reward loyalty, or punish rebellious vassals. Decisions of these courts had far-reaching effects and often served as an example for the subjects of the punishments or consequences that violations could entail. Parallel to secular jurisdiction, there was ecclesiastical jurisdiction, which had a special status. Canonical courts dealt with moral, marital, and ecclesiastical matters, including adultery, spiritual offenses, heresy, and disputes between clerics. These courts operated according to canon law, which consisted of ecclesiastical decrees, papal decrees, and theological interpretations. Ecclesiastical courts had their own staff, protocol systems, and specialized judges who understood theological questions and moral evaluations. The ecclesiastical jurisdiction had a high authority, as it could impose not only secular but also spiritual sanctions, including excommunication, penances, or the obligation to go on pilgrimages. In addition to the clear hierarchy, there were mixed forms and special courts. In some regions, patrimonial courts existed that were run by local nobles and dealt with both civil and criminal cases. These courts reflected the power of the landlords and allowed them to exert direct influence over the subjects. Guild and guild courts also played a central role, especially in urban centers, where craftsmen and merchants had their own rules and arbitrators. These courts settled disputes within the professions, monitored compliance with quality standards, and secured economic interests. The composition of the dishes varied and depended heavily on the context. Village courts were often composed of elders who were considered capable of making decisions based on their age, experience, and reputation. Municipal courts often consisted of a combination of elected citizens, lawyers, and city officials. Royal or ducal courts were made up of court officials, nobles, and specially trained judges. Ecclesiastical courts were used by clerics and canonical experts. This diversity reflected the different requirements, legal bases, and social hierarchies.
The hierarchy of jurisdiction influenced not only the course of trials, but also the type of penalties that were imposed. At the local level, fines, corporal punishment, or public humiliation were common. Higher courts could impose harsher punishments, including imprisonment, exile, or the death penalty. Ecclesiastical courts combined secular punishments with spiritual sanctions, thereby regulating the social and religious order at the same time. Overall, it can be seen that the medieval court system was a multi-layered network in which local customs, urban regulations, royal authority, and ecclesiastical law were intertwined. Each court reflected the hierarchy of society and was both an instrument of justice and an expression of power, social control, and cultural norms. The court structures formed the basis for a complex network of jurisprudence that decisively determined people's everyday lives, their security, and the political order of the Middle Ages.
Chapter 3. Prosecution and Defense in the Middle Ages. The procedures of a medieval court trial were characterized by a tension between prosecution, defense, and the limited formality that the legal system knew at that time. Who was accused was initially at the center of the proceedings, with the way in which an indictment was brought strongly dependent on social, political, and economic factors. In many cases, anyone who had an interest in doing so could bring an indictment. These could be neighbors, relatives, landlords, city officials, or even clergy. The motives ranged from personal revenge to economic advantages to political ambitions. The accusation itself was often oral, especially at the village and city level. It was enough for one person to publicly present the misconduct of another to set a trial in motion. In the case of more serious offenses, especially in royal or ecclesiastical courts, the accusations were recorded in writing, sometimes in the form of petitions or complaints. The prosecutor had to explain the allegations in detail, name evidence, or present witnesses. But even if evidence was available, its interpretation was strongly dependent on the social position of those involved. A peasant could hardly claim the same credibility as a wealthy citizen or a member of the nobility. Defense was severely limited in the Middle Ages compared to today's standards. There were hardly any lawyers or professional defense attorneys in the form we know them. The defendants often had to speak themselves, supported by relatives, friends, or an advocate chosen from the community. In cities, educated citizens or lawyers could be consulted, but here too, the room for maneuver was limited. The defense often consisted of presenting witness statements, taking their own oaths, or pointing out the unreliability of the prosecution. A central element of the defense was the oath. The defendant could swear that he was innocent, often on saints, relics, or the Bible. The oath had a high symbolic and practical significance. A broken oath was considered proof of guilt and could aggravate the punishment. In some cases, so-called divine judgments were also used as a means of defense or evidence. The defendant was able to pass a physical ritual, such as passing through fire or throwing himself into water, to prove his innocence. The result was interpreted as divine judgment. The roles of the parties were strongly hierarchical. Noble or wealthy citizens usually had more leeway, could present more witnesses, and had the means to defend themselves better. Poor or unfree people were often dependent on the credibility of their testimony and the support of a few witnesses in the defense. In this social structure, justice was often dependent on power, wealth, and influence, and less on objective truth. Proceedings before ecclesiastical courts also differ in defense. Here, the defendant could claim the support of clerics or ecclesiastical jurists who strengthened his argument in the light of canon law. Ecclesiastical courts often had their own set of rules in which moral, theological, and ethical aspects played a role. The defense here could also consist of showing repentance, offering penance, or hoping for divine forgiveness, which had a significant influence on the outcome. Despite the limited possibilities of defense, a growing awareness of fairness and legal certainty developed in the course of the Middle Ages.
In some cities, guild courts, counselors, or municipal authorities introduced procedures that involved the accused more closely, recorded witness statements in a more structured way, and documented decision-making. These early developments laid the foundation for later reforms in the legal system and showed that medieval justice had a certain degree of formal structure despite all its limitations. The nature of the prosecution and defense thus reflected the social and political structures of the time. Justice was closely linked to social status, power, and influence, while religious and cultural norms strongly shaped the process. The trial served not only to prosecute, but also to demonstrate social order, to secure authority, and to stabilize the community. In this dynamic, it became clear that a court trial in the Middle Ages was always more than a mere legal matter. It was a social and political ritual that combined power, status, and moral ideas.
Chapter 4. Evidence and Testimony in the Medieval Trial. In the Middle Ages, the procurement and evaluation of evidence was a central challenge of jurisprudence. Written documents were rare, sometimes unreliable or only available in handwritten transcripts, which is why the trial was heavily based on oral evidence, witness testimony, and oaths. Unlike modern legal systems, there was no standardized form of evidence gathering, and judges relied heavily on their experience, intuition, and judgment. The social position of the participants played just as important a role as the concrete content of the evidence, so that power relations were often more decisive than objective truth. Witnesses were of immense importance in the medieval trial. In village communities, older, respected men or women were considered credible because their age and reputation were considered a guarantee of truth. In municipal courts, craftsmen, merchants, or municipal officials could also appear as witnesses, but their testimony was often linked to their economic or political position. Rich and influential people were able to name more witnesses, while poor or unfree people often had few supporters. The credibility of a witness was thus not only a question of observation, but also of social ties, loyalty, and political constellation. A special form of proof was the oath or oath. Defendants and witnesses often had to swear on sacred objects, relics, or the Bible that their statements were true. A broken oath was considered proof of guilt and could have serious consequences. In many regions, oaths were also taken in ritual forms to emphasize the moral and religious dimension of the process. The link between religion and law was inseparable because the idea prevailed that God would punish the guilty and protect the innocent. In cases where witness testimony and circumstantial evidence were inadequate, so-called divine judgments were used. These trials were often dramatic and cruel and served to invoke divine justice as evidence of guilt or innocence. In fire or water tests, the defendant had to pass a physical test. An uninjured exit was considered a sign of innocence, while injuries were interpreted as proof of guilt. Difficult tests, such as wearing red-hot irons or immersing oneself in ice water, were also part of these rituals. Historically, these trials seem arbitrary and brutal from today's perspective, but they reflected the trust in supernatural justice at the time and at the same time had a strong chilling effect on the population. In addition to witness statements and oaths, material evidence was also used. These include stolen or damaged objects, letters, documents, or physical traces that allow conclusions to be drawn about the offense. In urban courts, this evidence was sometimes systematically documented and archived, while in the countryside, the collection of evidence was often improvised and strongly dependent on the interpretation of the judge. Community opinion also played a role. Objects or actions that were considered unethical or illegal were used as evidence by the parties to the trial. The evaluation of evidence was closely linked to social hierarchy and political power. Testimony against nobles or wealthy people had less impact, while testimony against ordinary citizens often had serious consequences. The intention of the prosecutor or the witnesses could also have a strong influence on the trial. The judges had to weigh up the moral, social, and legal dimensions, with the decision often being a reflection of the local power structures. The central role of witness statements and oaths shows how strongly medieval trials were based on trust, reputation, and credibility. Unlike in modern proceedings, objective evidence was secondary. The human factor and the social dimension were in the foreground. Trials were thus not only legal acts, but also social rituals in which power, loyalty, and social order became visible. The evidence was a mirror of the medieval world, in which law, religion, and social structures were inextricably linked. Chapter 5. The role of the nobility, clergy, and bourgeoisie in judicial trials. The medieval court trials were not only legal proceedings, but a reflection of the social hierarchy. Each layer of society had its own rights, duties, and access to justice, and its influence on the proceedings depended heavily on its position. The nobility, for example, enjoyed privileges that allowed them to claim their own courts in many cases, regardless of general jurisdiction. Noble rulers or landowners had the right to try their vassals and subjects before so-called patrimonial courts. These courts were an expression of their power and authority and enabled them to settle disputes within their domain without the intervention of higher authorities. The proceedings were often faster, more formal, and in favor of the nobleman, with the nobleman himself often acting as a judge or decisive decision-maker. The clergy also played a central role in medieval justice. Ecclesiastical courts dealt with violations of ecclesiastical law, moral offenses, adultery, heresy, and disputes between clergy. Clergy were not only defendants or plaintiffs, but also judges, lawyers, and consultants. Ecclesiastical jurisdiction was highly formalized, based on canon law, and linked secular and spiritual sanctions. A ruling by an ecclesiastical court could result in secular punishments, such as fines or imprisonment, and at the same time include spiritual measures, such as excommunication, pilgrimages, or public penitential rituals. In many cases, the church was a kind of control body that watched over moral behavior and at the same time stabilized the social order. The bourgeoisie, especially in urban centers, also had an influence on court cases, albeit in a different way. Merchants, craftsmen, and municipal officials were able to use their own municipal courts, which were created within the guilds and guilds. These courts had specific competencies, such as compliance with trade rules, disputes over contracts, quality standards, or economic conflicts. Participation in these proceedings was both a right and a duty for the members of the guilds. This reflected economic power. Wealthier citizens had more opportunities to organize testimony, gain supporters, and influence the proceedings. The interaction between the social classes was complex. Nobles were able to influence the proceedings in the city courts, while the clergy and bourgeoisie could also become active outside their own jurisdiction. Thus, conflicts often arose in which the power of the parties and the connections to higher instances decisively determined the outcome of a trial. Especially in high-profile cases involving nobles, clergymen, and wealthy citizens, political networking often played a greater role than actual evidence. The social position also had a direct impact on the punishments. Nobles often received milder sanctions or could pay fines to avoid physical punishment. Clergymen who had violated church law had to perform penances or complete rituals that were supposed to pay moral debts. Citizens and peasants who belonged to lower social classes were often more at risk of corporal punishment, public humiliation, or even the death penalty. The court proceedings thus served not only to enforce the law, but also to reproduce social hierarchies. Another feature was the symbolic function of the court trials. Nobles used it to demonstrate power, the clergy to legitimize moral authority, and the bourgeoisie to secure their own economic and political interests. Processes were therefore also public events in which power, influence, and social order were made visible. Public hearings, the participation of witnesses, the presentation of evidence, and the execution of punishments served both justice and social control.
The role of the nobility, clergy, and bourgeoisie in the judicial process shows that jurisdiction in the Middle Ages was inseparable from power and status. The court was not only a place of justice, but also a stage for social hierarchies on which social, political, and moral norms were negotiated at the same time. Each trial was an expression of the order of medieval society, in which a person's position significantly influenced his access to justice, the type of defense, and the severity of the punishment.
Chapter 6. Types of Punishment and Execution in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the execution of sentences was a central part of the legal system, which was largely shaped by social hierarchy, religious norms, and political power relations. The punishments were not only intended to punish the guilty, but also to demonstrate social order, secure authority, and discipline the population. In contrast to modern constitutional states, there were clear differences in the severity and type of punishments, which depended heavily on the social position of those involved. Nobles, clergy, wealthy citizens, and simple peasants were treated differently, and the choice of punishment reflected both the severity of the offense and the social status of the offender. One of the most common types of punishment was the fine. Wealthy citizens or nobles in particular could escape harsher punishment by paying fines. Fines served not only to make amends for an offense, but also as a source of income for rulers or communities. In urban centers, the amount of the fine often depended on the offender's assets and social status. This created a measure of justice that was economically understandable, but often reproduced social inequalities. For ordinary citizens, craftsmen, or farmers, the execution of corporal punishment was widespread. These ranged from caning to corporal punishment in public places. Corporal punishment served as a deterrent, public humiliation, and to secure social order. They were often carried out in public places so that the population witnessed the punishment. This practice had a double function. On the one hand, the perpetrator was to suffer, and on the other hand, the public was to be reminded of the consequences of violations of the law. Prison sentences were rather rare in the Middle Ages and were usually used as a preparatory measure or to secure defendants. Many prisons were inhospitable, dark, and unhygienic. The length of the prison sentence was often unclear, depending on the judge's decision or the possibility of paying a fine. In some cases, prisoners were used as leverage to force testimony or confessions, while in other situations, they were a form of isolation until a final decision was made. A particularly dramatic form of punishment was public executions. These were used for serious offenses such as murder, high treason, large-scale theft, or heresy. The methods ranged from hanging and decapitating to burning or quartering. Executions were ritualized and served as a deterrent example for the population. They were not only punishments, but also an expression of the power of the authorities, be it the king, the duke, or the church. At the same time, they had a symbolic function. They showed that justice and divine justice went hand in hand, that violations of the law did not go unpunished, and that social order was maintained. Church punishments differed considerably from secular punishments in their nature and execution. Heresy, adultery, or violations of church norms could result in penance, excommunication, pilgrimages, or public humiliation. The punishments had a moral and spiritual dimension, as they were intended to erase the sin and reintegrate the offender into the ecclesial community. Social status was less decisive than public impact and the moral message. Ecclesiastical jurisdiction conveyed power and moral order at the same time, through punishments which consolidated the position of the church in society. The execution of sentences was closely linked to social consciousness. Public punishments served not only as a deterrent, but also as a demonstration of the balance of power. They made it clear that social norms, hierarchical structures, and the authority of the rulers were binding. In this respect, the punishment had a double function. It punished misconduct and, at the same time, stabilized the social fabric. A special feature of the Middle Ages was the combination of secular and ecclesiastical punishment.
A defendant could be physically punished, fined, and morally sanctioned at the same time. This double dimension of punishment reflected the interplay of secular power, religion, and social norms. Punishments were thus not only a means of adjudication, but an expression of an entire worldview in which guilt, sin, and social order were inseparably linked. The types of punishment and their execution in the Middle Ages clearly show how closely law and society were intertwined. Punishments were instruments of control, expressions of power, means of moral education, and mirrors of social hierarchy. They showed how jurisprudence, religious norms, and social structures interacted, and how they helped maintain order, hierarchy, and authority in a world.
Chapter 7. Procedural Proceedings in Heresy and Ecclesiastical Jurisdiction. In the Middle Ages, ecclesiastical courts played a central role in preserving morality, faith, and social order. Heresy, the violation of the dogmas of the Church, was considered not only a spiritual offense, but a danger to social and political stability. The ecclesiastical jurisprudence therefore had a special significance because it could enforce spiritual and secular consequences at the same time. The procedures were strictly ritualized and oriented towards canon law, which consisted of papal decrees, ecclesiastical councils, and theological interpretations. Unlike secular trials, which were often pragmatic and local, ecclesiastical proceedings followed fixed rules that tied both the prosecution and the defense into a moral and ritual framework. The accusation of heresy could be brought by various people. Clergy, local officials, or concerned citizens reported alleged deviations from the Orthodox faith. As soon as there was a suspicion, an investigation was initiated. These proceedings often began with the summoning of the defendant, who had to provide information about his teachings, practices, or beliefs. In contrast to secular trials, in which material evidence and testimony could dominate, moral and theological questions were at the center of ecclesiastical proceedings. The defendants were asked to explain their beliefs and reaffirm their allegiance to the Church. Witness testimony was also of great importance here. Members of the congregation, other clergymen, or former followers of the accused could testify whether the accused had spread heretical teachings. The credibility of the witnesses was crucial, and the church hierarchy had a strong interest in the testimony supporting the existing order. In some cases, written documents, writings, or letters were also used as evidence to prove the heresy. These documents were carefully examined, with the interpretation strongly determined by theological standards. Oaths and confessions played a special role. The defendant could receive lenient treatment by voluntarily making a confession, especially if he showed remorse and recanted his teachings. A confession was understood as moral cleansing and as a sign of submission to ecclesiastical authority. In many cases, penances were imposed, ranging from pilgrimages to the wearing of certain signs to public penances. These sanctions had a symbolic meaning. They demonstrated both the power of the church and the possibility of the sinner's return to the community. However, the punishments for heresy could also be more drastic, especially if the defendant refused to recant or was considered a danger to the ecclesiastical order. In such cases, the accused were handed over to secular authority, which carried out death sentences, imprisonment, or corporal punishment. The most famous instrument was burning at the stake, which served as a deterrent example and at the same time made visible the connection between religious and secular power. The proceedings also had a public dimension. The community was informed, observers were often present, and the execution of the sentences served to demonstrate power and order. In this way, ecclesiastical trials were not only legal processes, but social events that made visible the moral norm, religious authority, and social hierarchy. Oaths and confessions played a special role. The defendant could receive lenient treatment by voluntarily making a confession, especially if he showed remorse and recanted his teachings. A confession was understood as moral cleansing and as a sign of submission to ecclesiastical authority. In many cases, penances were imposed, ranging from pilgrimages to the wearing of certain signs to public penances.
These sanctions had a symbolic meaning. They demonstrated both the power of the church and the possibility of the sinner's return to the community. However, the punishments for heresy could also be more drastic, especially if the defendant refused to recant or was considered a danger to the ecclesiastical order. In such cases, the accused were handed over to secular authority, which carried out death sentences, imprisonment, or corporal punishment. The most famous instrument was burning at the stake, which served as a deterrent example and at the same time made visible the connection between religious and secular power. The proceedings also had a public dimension. The community was informed, observers were often present, and the execution of the sentences served to demonstrate power and order. In this way, ecclesiastical trials were not only legal processes, but social events that made visible the moral norm, religious authority, and social hierarchy. Ecclesiastical courts also exercised control over morality in everyday life. Adultery, sexual deviance, idolatry, or violations of church holidays could be the subject of proceedings. These trials were often less dependent on material evidence and were based on witness testimony, confessions, and the interpretation of ecclesiastical authority. In many cases, the church combined criminal, moral, and social sanctions to regulate the behavior of the population and ensure the stability of the community. Church jurisprudence in the Middle Ages clearly shows the close connection between religion, power, and social order. Heresy was not only a problem of faith, but also a political and social problem. The trial served to preserve ecclesiastical authority, moral education, and control over the population. At the same time, they demonstrated how closely law and religion were intertwined and that justice in the Middle Ages was far more than the application of rules. It was an expression of power, morality, and social hierarchy.
Chapter 8. Witch Trials and Magical Crimes in the Middle Ages. Witchcraft and magical practices were a topic of great importance in the Middle Ages, occupying both ecclesiastical and secular justice. The fear of magic and sorcery was deeply rooted in notions of order, religion, and morality, and witch trials were often expressions of societal uncertainty and attempts to control deviation. Witchcraft was not only seen as an individual transgression, but as a threat to the community and the divine order. The belief in the effectiveness of sorcery and the pact with the devil led to the fact that accused persons were often persecuted with extreme severity. The accusations against witches or wizards often arose from neighborhood conflicts, resentment, or the desire to explain grievances in the community. Crop failures, diseases, unusual deaths, or animal diseases were often interpreted as the work of witches. As a result, people who were socially marginalized, old, poor, or living alone were particularly at risk of being accused of witchcraft. Women were particularly affected because in many societies they were considered more susceptible to diabolical temptations, and because patriarchal structures offered them less protection. The court proceedings for witchcraft were characterized by a special ritualism. Defendants often had to undergo repeated interrogations and interrogations, often accompanied by torture in order to extract confessions. These confessions were central as witchcraft was considered a secret act that could hardly be proven by witness testimony or material evidence. The use of torture was legally and morally controversial, but in many regions it was seen as a necessary means of establishing the truth about the hidden crimes. In addition to confessions, witness testimony played an important role. Neighbors, relatives, or other members of the community could make statements about unusual behavior, strange rituals, or alleged magic. These testimonies were often subjective and strongly influenced by fear, superstition, or personal conflicts. Judges had to weigh up the credibility of such reports, but the prevalence of superstition often led to hasty convictions. The symbolic and deterrent dimension of the punishments was particularly striking. Convicted witches were often executed in public, usually by burning at the stake. This served as a deterrent and to demonstrate the power of the church and authorities. The execution of the punishment was ritualized, often accompanied by processions, prayers, or public speeches that emphasized the moral and religious significance of the punishment. The executions also had the function of restoring the purity of the community and securing the divine order, which had been disturbed by the alleged witchcraft. The trials for magical crimes were closely linked to the ecclesiastical Inquisition. The Inquisition monitored the observance of religious norms and conducted trials against heretics and witches. It combined legal proceedings with religious interpretation and was both a political instrument and a moral control body. Defendants could receive secular punishments, penances, or the death penalty, making the power of the church visible at all levels. Witch trials had far-reaching social and political consequences. They led to fear and mistrust within the community, reinforced patriarchal and hierarchical structures, and created a climate of insecurity. The proceedings showed how closely law, religion, and social control were linked, and how the fear of deviation from norms was used to secure power. The study of witchcraft and magical crimes makes it clear that medieval court trials were not only legal processes, but also social rituals that made visible moral norms, religious ideas, and social power. They reflected the fears of the population, the authority of the church, and the political structures, and made it clear that justice in the Middle Ages was far more than a legal category. It was an instrument of social order, demonstration of power, and moral control. Chapter 9. Women and Court Trials in the Middle Ages: Roles, Rights, and Discrimination. Women played an ambivalent role in the medieval legal system. They were both actors and victims within the judiciary, with their rights and the possibilities of defense strongly dependent on their social status, marital status, and the respective region. Women were particularly exposed in cases of marriage, sexuality, property, and moral transgression, as their actions were often seen as a reflection of the moral state of a family or community. The laws of the Middle Ages often distinguished between married women, unmarried women, widows, and prostitutes, with social expectations and restrictions significantly influencing the type of legal treatment. In marital and family matters, women had only limited rights. Disputes over dowry, adultery, or marital duties were dealt with in both secular and ecclesiastical courts. Ecclesiastical courts played a special role in this, as marriage, sexuality, and moral order were closely linked to church law. Women accused of adultery were often more heavily burdened than male partners, as the social expectation of their fidelity and subordination played a central role. Penances, public humiliation, or even corporal punishment could be the result, while men often received milder sanctions. Women's access to court proceedings as plaintiffs was restricted, but in certain cases, they had the right to take legal action, especially when it came to property rights, inheritances, or economic disputes. Wealthy women or daughters of influential families were better able to exercise these rights, while poor women were dependent on the support of relatives or patrons. The possibility of appearing as a plaintiff was thus strongly tied to social power, and women in lower social classes had little influence on the outcome of proceedings. Testimonies from women were evaluated differently. In some regions, they were considered less credible than men's testimony, while in other cases, older or respected women in particular were accepted as important witnesses. Women could also act as mediators, advocates, or experts on moral and everyday issues, for example, in cases of neighborhood disputes, household conflicts, or in assessing the lives of other women. Nevertheless, their position in court often remained marginal, and their testimony was heavily influenced by social norms and the perception of male judges. In cases of accusations of witchcraft, magic, or moral offenses, women were particularly vulnerable. Many of the people convicted as witches were elderly women, single people, or women on the fringes of society. The social prejudice that women are more susceptible to diabolical temptations led to them being disproportionately often the target of accusations. The trials were brutal, and women often only had the option of obtaining a lighter sentence through confession, repentance, or support from family members. High-profile executions and penitential rituals also made them specimens that were intended to deter the population and secure social order. Economically active women were also subject to special legal conditions. Female traders, craftswomen, or owners of small businesses had to prove themselves in municipal or guild courts, often meeting male relatives or representatives to assert their interests. Their economic autonomy was limited, and in many cases they were subject to the decisions of male judges or colleges. Still, wealthy women could wield influence if they had resources, connections, or education, which allowed them to make both defense and prosecution effective. The role of women in the medieval legal system shows a complex mixture of discrimination, limited rights, and nevertheless existing scope for action. Women were often victims of patriarchal norms, but at the same time, they were able to actively participate in processes and defend their rights in certain contexts. Their legal position was closely linked to social expectation, moral control, and social status, highlighting gender inequality within the legal system. Women in medieval litigation were thus not only passive objects of justice, but also actors whose actions, statements, and positions reflected the social and moral structures of the time. Their experiences illustrate how strongly the legal system was shaped by hierarchy, gender, and social norms, and how the judiciary remained at the same time an instrument of control and a mirror of medieval society. Chapter 10. Duration of proceedings and trial organization in the Middle Ages. The organization and duration of court trials in the Middle Ages depended on a variety of factors that reflected both the social structure of society and geographical and administrative conditions. Unlike in modern legal systems, there was no standardized process, no fixed deadlines or clearly regulated process steps. Rather, the complexity of the case, the balance of power, the number of participants, and the available resources determine the speed and structure of a procedure. The duration of the proceedings could vary greatly. Some processes were completed within a few days, while others dragged on for months or even years. At the local level, for example in villages or small towns, processes were often relatively short and pragmatic. Here, it was important to resolve disputes quickly so as not to place an excessive burden on the community and to maintain social order. The judges, usually village chiefs, councils of elders, or officials, decided on the basis of witness statements, oaths, and local customs. Those involved had to appear in person, and the proceedings were public, so neighbors and members of the community acted as witnesses, supporters, or observers. The trials were heavily influenced by oral communication, and written documentation was rare, which could significantly shorten the duration but also increase the influence of power, persuasiveness, and social status. In larger cities or in urban courts, the process organization could be more complex. Here, several parties often had to be involved. Witnesses had to be summoned and statements recorded. Municipal courts kept registers of proceedings, decisions, and penalties in order to structure the administration and ensure the consistency of the judiciary. The involvement of guilds, or economic representatives meant that processes took longer, as it took time to follow rules, examine evidence, and coordinate several participants. At the same time, this organization offered more legal certainty, as decisions were more comprehensible and documented. At a higher level, for example in royal, ducal, or ecclesiastical courts, the duration of the trial could increase considerably. These courts dealt with complex disputes, capital crimes, or religious matters that had far-reaching consequences. The preparation of proceedings was time-consuming. Indictments had to be collected, witness statements examined, legal opinions obtained, and the accused summoned. In ecclesiastical trials, such as heresy or witchcraft trials, additional steps could be added, such as theological reports, spiritual examinations, or penitential orders, which extended the process. The duration of trials was also highly dependent on the willingness of the parties to cooperate or escalate conflicts. Belligerent parties who delayed witnesses, refused to appear, or exerted pressure on judges by exerting influence could prolong proceedings considerably.
In some cases, trials were dragged out for years until power shifts, political changes, or interventions by higher authorities made a final verdict possible. The process organization was closely linked to the question of resources. Defendants and plaintiffs often need support from relatives, advisors, or patrons to mobilize witnesses, secure documents, or prepare their own defense. Wealthy citizens were able to influence the speed and outcome of proceedings through financial means, while poorer or socially disadvantaged people were dependent on the favor of the judges or the support of the community. The social dimension thus had a direct impact on the efficiency and fairness of processes. Public hearings that accompanied the process also served transparency and social control. The duration was not only legally relevant, but also symbolically. Longer proceedings were able to maintain the public's attention, demonstrate power relations, and increase social pressure on those involved. Short trials, on the other hand, had the advantage of quickly restoring social order, but were less suitable for comprehensively dealing with complex moral or political questions. In summary, it can be said that the duration of proceedings and the organization of trials in the Middle Ages were highly variable and were determined by social, economic, political, and religious factors. Trials served not only to adjudicate, but also to demonstrate power, regulate the community, and maintain social order. They were an expression of a legal system that reacted flexibly to the complex conditions of medieval society, whereby justice, efficiency, and social control were often in tension with each other.
Chapter 11. Torture and Coercive Measures in Medieval Trials. Torture and coercive measures were among the central instruments of justice in the Middle Ages, especially in serious offenses or cases in which guilt was difficult to prove. They were both a means of establishing the truth and a demonstration of power, and reflected the understanding of justice and authority that shaped medieval society. Torture was not only used to extort confessions, but also had a social and symbolic function. It was intended to deter people, make the power of the authorities visible, and enforce compliance with norms. The use of torture was subject to certain conditions. It was usually only allowed to be used in the case of serious crimes or in cases where other evidence was not sufficient. Defendants accused of witchcraft, heresy, treason, or theft on a large scale were particularly frequently affected. Before the use of torture, decisions were often taken by judges, officials, or church authorities to legitimize the legality of the measures. In ecclesiastical proceedings, it was also necessary to observe certain ritual rules in order to ensure the moral justification of violence. The methods of torture were varied and cruel. Defendants were often placed on special devices such as stretching benches, on which the limbs were twisted or stretched to create pain. Water torture, immersion or forcing water intake, as well as wheeling and other physical torture were used to force confessions. In some regions, psychological methods were used that used fear and isolation to break the will of the accused. Each method was designed to wear down the body, destabilize the psyche, and force a confession that served as evidence of guilt. The torture was highly ritualized and public. In some cases, spectators were allowed to demonstrate the authority of the judges and the power of the legal system. The public nature of torture had a deterrent function and was intended to make clear to the community the consequences of violations of the law. At the same time, she underlined the irreversibility of authority. The authorities were able to use physical violence to enforce order and obedience. Coercive measures went beyond physical torture. Defendants could be pressured by incarceration, social isolation, or confiscation of property. These measures were intended to force confessions, secure cooperation, or weaken the social position of the accused. In the case of wealthy or influential people, financial constraints were used, such as the seizure of assets or the threat of economic disadvantages. In this way, the judiciary combined physical, psychological, and economic pressure to achieve the desired result. The role of torture was also closely linked to the belief in divine justice. In church trials, torture was often seen as a necessary means of discerning the truth about moral offenses or heresy, as it was assumed that God would protect the innocent and punish the guilty.
The combination of human violence and divine legitimacy strengthened the moral and legal authority of the church and contributed to the popular acceptance of the proceedings even though they were brutal. Despite its widespread use, torture was controversial. Contemporary voices expressed concerns about the unreliability of forced confessions, the cruelty of the methods, and the risk of abuse. Nevertheless, it remained an instrument of justice for centuries, used by both secular and ecclesiastical courts to maintain control, power, and order. The use of torture in medieval trials shows the close connection between violence, law, and social control. It illustrates how much the medieval legal system relied on authority, deterrence, and the enforcement of norms, and how strongly justice, religion, and social order were intertwined. Torture was not only a means of establishing the truth, but also an expression of social power relations, moral ideas, and the central role of the authorities in maintaining order in a complex, hierarchical society.
Chapter 12. The influence of local traditions and customs on court proceedings. In the Middle Ages, jurisdiction was closely linked to regional customs and customs. In contrast to modern constitutional states, there was no uniform code that was binding for all regions, but rather, court proceedings reflected the social, cultural, and economic characteristics of the respective community. Local traditions influenced not only the type of prosecution and defense, but also the selection of judges, the conduct of trials, and the type of punishments imposed. This local roots meant that the same offense was severely punished in one region, but punished mildly in another. Village communities developed their own rules over generations, which were passed on orally. These customs regulated conflicts between neighbors, inheritance disputes, property claims, and moral violations. The judges were often experienced elders or officials whose judgment was based on reputation, wisdom, and knowledge of local customs. A verdict was considered fair if it was in line with the expectations of the community, and the social ties between the parties involved played a decisive role. These procedures were often less formalized but allowed for quick and accepted conflict resolution. In urban centers that had their own courts, local traditions were also taken into account. Guilds and smiths had their own rules and norms that were applied within the professions. Craft disputes, breaches of contract, and violations of quality standards were negotiated according to these industry-specific practices. The authority of the guild could influence the social order beyond the process, as the decisions had to be accepted by all members in order to ensure the social cohesion of the professional community. Local customs also played a role in larger territorial courts, such as those of dukes or kings. Although these courts applied super-regional laws, they often had to take into account the expectations and traditions of the population to ensure acceptance. An example of this was the application of customary law, which in many regions was older than the official decrees of the rulers. Judges had to weigh up whether to respect traditional practices or to judge strictly according to royal guidelines, with political and social stability always at the forefront. Church jurisdiction was also shaped by local traditions, especially with regard to penitential practices and ritual procedures. Church leaders adapted their procedures to the customs of the community, so that penances, public humiliations, or religious rituals were designed differently depending on the region. This adaptation facilitated the enforcement of ecclesiastical authority, as it was familiar to the people and perceived as just, even if it formally deviated from canon law. Local traditions also influenced the duration of the trials, the selection of witnesses, and the way in which evidence was presented. In regions where a sense of community and neighborly relations were strong, processes were often accelerated, as conflicts had to be resolved quickly to avoid social tensions. In areas with complicated feudal structures or strong political control, procedures took longer because of the need for the involvement of multiple stakeholders and coordination between different levels of the hierarchy. Another aspect was the influence of social norms on the punishments. In some regions, certain offenses have traditionally been punished with fines, while in others with corporal punishment or public humiliation. The punishment had to be in line with traditional practices in order for it to be accepted as legitimate by the population.
A verdict that contradicted local traditions could provoke mistrust, protest, or even riots. The importance of local traditions in the medieval legal system shows that court proceedings were not solely dependent on formal laws or royal decrees, but were strongly influenced by the social, cultural, and moral ideas of the community. The judges had to weigh up formal law, the expectations of the parties involved, and the needs of society in order to ensure both justice and social stability. Ultimately, court proceedings reflected the values, norms, and hierarchies of the respective region. They were an expression of a flexible legal system that respected local peculiarities, enforced the authority of the authorities, and at the same time stabilized the social order. The consideration of customs and customary law was not only pragmatic, but also necessary to ensure the acceptance of the population and to establish the law as a legitimate and moral instrument.
Chapter 13. Litigation Costs, Bribery, and Corruption in the Middle Ages. Trials in the Middle Ages were often associated with considerable financial and social costs, which greatly influenced justice. The judiciary was a complex web of secular and ecclesiastical authorities, local customs, and hierarchical structures, and access to justice was rarely free or neutral. Legal costs, fees for ushers, expenses for witnesses, rations for defendants in custody, and the provision of defense lawyers or advocates made a court case a considerable expense that was often almost impossible for poorer sections of the population to cope with. Those who could not bear these costs were severely limited in their defense and often at the mercy of the will of the richer or more powerful opposing side. In addition, bribery played an essential role in the medieval legal system. Judges, officials, and lay judges could be influenced by financial contributions or gifts, which undermined the neutrality of the proceedings. Wealthy citizens or nobles systematically used these possibilities to secure verdicts in their favor, influence witnesses, or mitigate the punishments for offenses. Corruption was often institutionally entrenched and tacitly tolerated, as it facilitated access to justice for the powerful while maintaining social control over the population. Similar mechanisms have been observed in cities and guild communities. Commercial courts, guild courts, and municipal courts charged fees for filing lawsuits or participating in negotiations. These costs could vary depending on the plaintiff's assets or the social position of the defendant. The fees were officially used to cover administrative costs, but often also had the function of restricting the participation of the lower classes of the population and controlling access to justice. The combination of litigation costs and bribery led to a legal system that was heavily dependent on social status and economic power. Rich citizens could not only better represent their interests, but also influence the speed and outcome of proceedings. Poor or unfree persons, on the other hand, were often dependent on the favor of the judges and had little chance of effectively defending themselves against accusations. This social inequality was a central feature of medieval jurisprudence. Corruption also manifested itself in influencing witnesses and manipulating proceedings. Officials who were financially dependent on the parties could manipulate statements, withhold evidence, or delay the proceedings. Such practices weaken the legitimacy of the judiciary and lead to mistrust among the population. At the same time, corruption was a means of stabilizing existing power relations, as wealthy and influential people were able to secure their dominance by controlling court proceedings. Ecclesiastical courts were not completely free of these problems. Here, too, gifts, influence by local nobles, or the creation of patronage relationships could influence the proceedings. In some cases, the outcome of a trial was decisively shaped by the relationship between the defendant and a well-meaning clergyman. The moral authority of the church was in tension with practical power dynamics, and the population was aware of this ambivalence. The effects of litigation costs and corruption were manifold. They led to justice being strongly dependent on social status and economic power, to delaying or rigging proceedings, and to the public perception of justice remaining ambivalent.
Trials were seen not only as legal instruments, but also as a means of social control, a demonstration of power, and the preservation of hierarchical structures. At the same time, it became apparent that despite these restrictions, a certain form of legal order was maintained. Even under conditions of bribery and high costs, the courts were guided by traditional norms, customs, and religious guidelines, which allowed for a certain stability and predictability of the legal system. The population understood the rules, accepted them in part, and used their own strategies to influence procedures within the restrictions. The consideration of legal costs, bribery, and corruption makes it clear that medieval jurisprudence was not only of a legal nature, but also of an economic and political nature. It shows the close connection between justice, social hierarchy, and power, and illustrates how strongly economic means and influence determined access to justice and the enforcement of judgments. Processes have thus always been a mirror of the social structures, economic inequalities, and power dynamics that shaped medieval life.
Chapter 14. Appeals and Appeals in the Middle Ages. In the medieval legal system, the possibility of appealing against decisions of courts was severely limited and closely tied to social, political, and economic conditions. Unlike in modern legal systems, there were no standardized appointment procedures, but rather a system composed of local traditions, royal decrees, and ecclesiastical regulations. Those who disagreed with a verdict often had to have considerable resources, use political contacts, or seek the support of influential patrons to defend their position before a higher court. Appeals were possible in particular before higher courts, such as municipal, ducal, or royal instances. In such cases, a judgment could be appealed if the plaintiff or defendant considered that the outcome of the proceedings had been unfair, erroneous, or influenced by corruption. However, the possibility of appeal was by no means automatic. It required the recognition of the higher jurisdiction and the willingness of local judges to pass on the decision. Often, appeal procedures were also used by higher authorities to exercise political control or to demonstrate loyalty to rulers and church authority. At the local level, the filing of appeals was severely restricted. Village courts or guild courts often had no institutional mechanisms that made an appeal possible. In such cases, it was only possible to try to revise a verdict by directly appealing to higher secular or ecclesiastical authorities. This required not only personal relationships, but also an understanding of the hierarchical structures that were crucial for access to higher instances. Poor or socially disadvantaged people were often excluded from these opportunities, while wealthy, nobles, or influential citizens could more easily use access to higher authorities. Ecclesiastical courts played a special role in the field of appeals. Heresy, marital, or moral disputes could be forwarded to higher ecclesiastical authorities, such as bishops, cardinals, or even the Pope. In these cases, the vocation was closely linked to theological and moral considerations, and the outcome depended heavily on the interpretation of ecclesiastical norms. The ecclesiastical appointment procedures were formalized with clearly defined procedures and documentation, with the moral integrity and loyalty of the parties often being as decisive as the factual arguments. The nature of the appeals could vary. In some cases, the appeal meant a full retrial, rehearing all witness testimony and examining evidence. In other cases, the procedure was limited to verifying the formal legality of the judgment, in particular, compliance with oaths, regulations, or protocols. This flexibility was necessary to take account of the different regional circumstances, but led to considerable uncertainty, as the outcome of the appeal procedures could not be guaranteed. A decisive factor was the duration of the appeal proceedings. This could take months or even years, especially if political authorities, distant courts, or church authorities were involved. During this time, defendants often remained in prison, had to pay fines or security deposits, and were restricted in their social position. The long duration of the procedures showed how closely jurisprudence, power structures, and social control were intertwined, and that the legal system fulfilled not only legal but also social functions. The possibility of appointment also served to demonstrate power and authority.
Rulers and ecclesiastical authorities used higher courts to exercise control over local jurisdiction, verify loyalty, and stabilize social order. Appointment procedures were therefore not only instruments of justice, but also means of demonstrating power and social regulation. Overall, the practice of legal remedies and appeal procedures in the Middle Ages shows how strongly law, power, and social hierarchy were intertwined. Access to higher instances depended on social, economic, and political factors, and the outcome of the proceedings reflected both the individual abilities of the participants and the power relations of the community. Appointment procedures were thus not only legal instruments, but also an expression of the medieval order, in which justice, loyalty, and social control were inextricably linked.
Chapter 15. The Role of Witnesses in the Medieval Trial. Witnesses played a central role in the medieval legal system, as written evidence was rare, and the judiciary relied heavily on oral traditions, oaths, and personal testimony. The testimony of a witness could have a decisive influence on the outcome of a trial, whether in disputes over property, accusations of theft, murder, or moral offenses such as adultery or heresy. In a society in which social hierarchies and power relations shaped everyday life, the selection, credibility, and position of a witness was often just as important as the actual content of his testimony. In village courts, older, distinguished men or women were often called as witnesses because their age, experience, and prestige were believed to give them credibility. Their observations and testimony were considered particularly reliable, and they often carried considerable weight in the decision-making process. In smaller communities, the prominence and social networking of the witness also played a role. A neighbor who was highly respected in the community was able to exert considerable influence on the proceedings with his testimony, while someone with a low reputation or hostile relations with the defendant was hardly considered. In urban courts, the role of witnesses was more complex. Craftsmen, merchants, or municipal officials could act as experts on certain matters, such as contract disputes, quality checks, or trade conflicts. A witness's testimony in these contexts was often associated with economic expertise, and its credibility depended on work experience, social rank, and connections. Particularly influential citizens or members of guilds could name several witnesses to strengthen their position, while ordinary city dwellers often had fewer opportunities to recruit witnesses for support. Church trials also rely heavily on witness testimony, especially in cases of heresy, witchcraft, or moral transgression. The witnesses had to testify whether the defendant had violated church norms or whether there were deviations from religious practices. Their statements were often given in connection with oaths to ensure truthfulness. A broken oath could be taken as proof of guilt and often had serious consequences, both secular and spiritual. The selection of witnesses was often influenced by social and political factors. Wealthy or influential individuals had more opportunities to mobilize trustworthy witnesses, while the poor and unfree often relied on the limited support of neighbors or relatives. At the same time, witnesses themselves could be influenced by social constraints, loyalty, or fear, so that their testimony was sometimes strategic or manipulative. The judges had to take these factors into account in order to evaluate the credibility of the testimony and make a fair decision. Taking an oath was another central element. Witnesses often had to swear to tell the truth, often on religious symbols, relics, or the Bible. This practice closely linked law and religion and strengthened the moral obligation of the witnesses. At the same time, the oath offered the judges an instrument to secure the testimony with an overriding moral claim. The combination of witness testimony and oaths made the presentation of evidence in the Middle Ages particularly dependent on the credibility and reputation of those involved. The role of the witnesses was not limited to testifying in court. In many communities, they also acted as advisors, mediators, or moral authorities. Their observations and recommendations could influence the course of proceedings even before they had officially begun. In cases of witchcraft, moral offenses, or neighborhood disputes, witnesses often held a crucial position of power as their perception could shape the definition of guilt and innocence within the community. Overall, the role of witnesses in medieval litigation makes it clear that law, social hierarchy, and morality were closely intertwined. The credibility of a witness depended not only on his powers of observation, but also on his social position, connections, and reputation. Trials were therefore not only legal processes, but social rituals in which power, morality, and social order became visible. Testimonies were the central instrument for enforcing law, maintaining social control, and stabilizing the norms of the community, and they reflected the complex interconnectedness of power, credibility, and law in everyday medieval life. Chapter 16. The Role of Judges in Medieval Trial. Judges in the Middle Ages played a central role in the legal system, which was strongly influenced by social hierarchies, local traditions, and religious norms. They were not only legal decision-makers, but also political actors, moral authorities, and holders of power within their communities. Their decisions not only influenced the fate of the defendants, but also had an impact on the stability of the community, the enforcement of social norms, and the authority of the nobility, church, and urban authorities. The selection of judges depended on the respective court level and the social context. At the local level, elders or village chiefs were often appointed as judges, whose experience, prestige, and wisdom formed the basis of their authority. They decided on the basis of customary law, oral traditions, and knowledge of social relations in the community. In urban centers, judges could be trained lawyers, counselors, or civil servants who had access to written protocols and municipal ordinances. These judges were more formalized and had a higher degree of institutional legitimacy, which allowed them to preside over more complex proceedings. Royal, ducal, or ecclesiastical courts appointed judges, who were often appointed directly by the rulers. These judges had the task not only of administering justice, but also of demonstrating political power and order. Their rulings served to enforce royal or ecclesiastical authority and were at the same time a means of controlling local power structures. They had to take into account dependencies, loyalties, and political networks, as their decisions often had far-reaching consequences and could trigger power shifts. The judges were responsible for organizing the proceedings, admitting witnesses, evaluating evidence, and reaching the final verdict. They had to interpret the interplay of witness statements, oaths, written documents, and physical evidence, often in a context where formal rules were less strict than they are today. In ecclesiastical proceedings, theological evaluation was also of central importance. Judges had to examine whether there had been violations of canon law, moral transgressions, or heresy, taking into account the spiritual dimension of guilt in sentencing. A special feature of medieval judges was the balance between formal authority and social acceptance. Their decisions had to be accepted by the population, otherwise the social order was endangered. If local customs or customary laws were disregarded, even a legally correct verdict could meet with resistance. Judges therefore often had to weigh up the strict application of the law, the expectations of the community, and the interests of the rulers. This balance made their role particularly challenging, as they required legal competence as well as political sensitivity and moral judgment. The judges also had the task of determining sentences and supervising their execution. They determined fines, corporal punishment, public humiliation, or, in extreme cases, the death penalty. In church trials, they could order penances, pilgrimages, or excommunications. Their decisions were thus directly linked to the exercise of power and had both practical and symbolic significance. The execution of the sentences was a means of demonstrating authority and stabilizing the social order. Judges also had to assess the credibility of witnesses, taking into account social, political, and personal factors. They had the task of recognizing and balancing manipulation, influence, and partisan interests.
In a legal system that relied heavily on oral testimony, oaths, and social relationships, this ability was critical to enforcing justice. The role of judges shows that medieval trials went far beyond legal decisions. They were expressions of power, moral authority, and social control. Judges were mediators between law, tradition, religion, and social order. Their decisions not only shaped the fate of individual people, but also stabilized hierarchies, regulated conflicts, and demonstrated the legitimacy of rule. Overall, the function of the judges makes it clear that jurisdiction in the Middle Ages represented a complex mixture of legal competence, political power, and social responsibility. Judges were central actors whose judgments had to determine the balance between law, community, and authority, and thus maintain the structure and stability of medieval society.
Chapter 17. The Importance of Protocols and Written Documentation in Medieval Court Trials. Although the medieval legal system relied heavily on oral tradition, testimony, and oaths, written documentation played an increasingly important role, especially in urban centers, before royal or ecclesiastical courts. Protocols and documents served not only to record the proceedings, but also to legitimize decisions, secure rights, and monitor compliance with standards. They were an expression of a growing bureaucratization of the judiciary and allowed for a certain consistency in jurisprudence that went beyond local traditions. The preparation of minutes often began with the filing of a lawsuit. Defendants, plaintiffs, and witnesses were noted by name. Accusations were recorded, and initial evidence was documented. In city courts, scribes kept records of the course of the trial, including witness statements, oaths, motions made, and decisions of the judges. These records made it possible to refer back to the course of the trial later, to examine appeals, or to initiate appeal proceedings. They thus contributed significantly to the formal legitimacy of the trial and created a comprehensible basis for decisions. In ecclesiastical proceedings, the documentation was particularly detailed and ritualized. The Church attached great importance to the fact that procedures were conducted in accordance with canon law and religious norms. As a result, protocols included not only the legal facts, but also moral evaluations, penance orders, retraction of confessions, and spiritual measures. Written records also served as accountability to higher ecclesiastical authorities, such as bishops, cardinals, or the Pope. They made it possible to control the implementation of church guidelines and ensured the uniformity of religious jurisprudence. Protocols also had a social and political function. They documented the authority of the judges, the loyalty of the witnesses, and the observance of procedures. In cases of conflict, appeal, or dispute between local communities, written records could serve as evidence and help legitimize decisions about power and status. At the same time, they held those involved responsible and helped to reduce arbitrariness, although influence, bribery, and corruption continued to play a role. The importance of written documentation continued to increase in the course of the Middle Ages. With the growing administration, the emergence of municipal registers, and the formalization of procedures, the obligation to keep records became more and more binding. Documents, complaints, witness statements, and judgments were systematically archived. This practice made it possible to reconstruct proceedings in the long term, to enforce judgments, and to collect historical data that were later important for administration, research, or jurisprudence. In many regions, written documents were combined with oral rituals. The reading of protocols, the public reading of judgments, or the presentation of oaths were used to demonstrate the authority of the judiciary and to secure social order. Documentation was thus not only an administrative tool, but also an instrument of demonstration of power. She made it clear that decisions were not made arbitrarily, but according to comprehensible rules and procedures. Another advantage of written records was that they facilitated access to remedies and appeals. Anyone who wanted to appeal to a higher court could rely on detailed protocols that documented the course of the original proceedings. This was especially important in cases where testimony was unreliable, evidence was disputed, or the social position of the parties was unevenly distributed.
Written documents made it possible to establish continuity, accountability, and legitimacy. The importance of protocols and written documentation shows how the medieval legal system gradually became more professional and structured. Even though oral statements, oaths, and local customs continue to form the basis of many proceedings, written records created a permanent, traceable basis for decision-making, administration, and social control. They were an instrument that stabilized jurisprudence, made power visible, and made the complexity of medieval court proceedings manageable. Overall, the role of protocols makes it clear that medieval court proceedings went far beyond oral proceedings. They combined legal, social, political, and religious dimensions by documenting law, power, and authority. The written record helped ensure that processes were traceable, controllable, and effective in the long term, and it formed the basis for the development of a formal and structured legal system that met the challenges of a complex hierarchical society.
Chapter 18. The Execution of Sentences and Public Punishments in the Middle Ages. The execution of sentences in the Middle Ages was a central part of jurisprudence and served not only to punish the guilty, but also to demonstrate power, authority, and social order. Unlike in modern justice systems, punishments were rarely purely private or discreet. They often took place in public in order to instruct the population, stabilize norms, and make visible the influence of rulers, ecclesiastical authorities, or local officials. The form, duration, and severity of the execution were closely linked to the social position, economic power, and political affiliation of the convicted person. Public punishments had a dual function. On the one hand, they should punish the offender himself, and on the other hand, they should have a deterrent effect on the community. The people who observed the enforcement were reminded of the consequences of violations and learned which norms and rules were binding. Particularly drastic punishments such as beatings, flogging, branding, or even the death penalty were carried out in public to demonstrate the power of the judiciary and the authority of the authorities. These performances had a highly ritualized dimension and were part of a social learning process that conveyed the hierarchies and morals of society. The type of punishment depended heavily on the social status of the convicted. Nobles, wealthy citizens, or persons with political influence were often able to avoid physical punishment through fines, pilgrimages, or other symbolic sanctions. Poor or unfree people, on the other hand, were much more affected by corporal punishment and were often publicly humiliated to illustrate the social hierarchy. Church punishments combined moral and spiritual dimensions with secular sanctions. Excommunication, penances, or pilgrimages were often accompanied by fines or physical measures, so that the execution fulfilled both religious and social functions. The execution of the punishments was highly ritualized. Bailiffs, officials, or specially appointed executors ensured that the instructions of the judges were precisely implemented. The punishments often took place in central locations, market squares, church forecourts, or at the gates of urban centers, so that as many people as possible witnessed the punishment. The public increased the social impact of punishment, created fear, demonstrated power, and consolidated control over the population. In addition to corporal punishment and fines, there were also long-term forms of enforcement such as incarceration, banishment, or the seizure of property. These measures served both to secure the punishment and to control social behavior. Incarceration could isolate the accused, exert social influence, and force a confession, while the seizure of assets demonstrated economic power while weakening the position of the perpetrator. Exile was often a combination of punishment and social control, as the offender was removed from the community but continued to serve as a moral warning to the population. In cases of high treason, heresy, or witchcraft, punishments were carried out particularly drastically and spectacularly. Burns at the stake, beheadings, wheels, or other methods of execution served as a drastic example of the consequences of serious violations. Church and secular authorities often coordinated the execution so that both secular power and moral authority were demonstrated.
The public nature of these executions made it clear that compliance with norms, laws, and religious regulations was central to the stability of the community. The execution of sentences was also closely linked to psychological and social mechanisms. The observation of punishments served as a deterrent, moral education, and the stabilization of hierarchies. It made it clear that social norms were binding and that violations didn't go unnoticed. At the same time, the execution was a reflection of the balance of power, as the punishments always reflected the position of the perpetrator and the authority of the rulers. Overall, the practice of enforcement shows that medieval court proceedings went far beyond legal decisions. Punishments were not only a means of justice, but also instruments of social control, a demonstration of power, and moral education. The public dimension, the social differentiation of the sanctions, and the ritualized implementation make it clear that enforcement in the Middle Ages represented a complex interplay of law, power, and community that ensured the order and stability of society in the long term.
Chapter 19. Conflicts between secular and ecclesiastical justice in the Middle Ages. Medieval justice was characterized by a complex interplay of secular and ecclesiastical jurisdiction, which often led to conflicts. While secular courts were under the control of kings, dukes, counts, or city authorities and mainly dealt with political, economic, or criminal matters, ecclesiastical courts controlled violations of religious norms, moral transgressions, and ecclesiastical law. The overlapping of responsibilities often led to tensions as both systems sought to assert their authority and secure their influence. A central area of conflict concerned moral and ethical offenses, such as adultery, sexual deviance, blasphemy, or heresy. These violations could have both secular and ecclesiastical consequences. Thus, on the one hand, adultery could lead to a fine or corporal punishment in the secular court, while at the same time the church imposed penance, public humiliation, or spiritual punishment. Parallel jurisdiction led to competition between court systems and made coordination difficult, especially when the interests of the parties were in conflict with the power of the clergy or secular authorities. Heresy was a particularly sensitive field. The church claimed sole authority to judge religious deviations, but secular rulers had an interest in maintaining social order and political stability. In cases where heretical behavior was interpreted as a threat to the peace or loyalty of the people, secular authorities intervened and enforced punishments initiated by the church but carried out by the authorities. This cooperation was often fraught with conflict, as the secular power wanted to retain control over the sentencing or execution, while the church claimed moral and theological legitimacy. Another area of tension arose in property and inheritance disputes, in which both secular and ecclesiastical rights were affected. Church property was often affected by secular conflicts, as nobles or communities asserted claims to land, income, or rights controlled by church institutions. Ecclesiastical courts protected the interests of the church, while secular courts defended the power of rulers or local elites. These parallel claims led to lengthy processes in which political power, social position, and religious authority were negotiated simultaneously. The overlapping of jurisdictions also led to tactical conflicts between judges. Secular judges tried to influence church proceedings in order to make sentences milder or to influence decisions in favor of political allies. Church judges, on the other hand, claimed moral supremacy in order to prevent secular interference and consolidate ecclesiastical authority. This dynamic made the judiciary an instrument not only of law enforcement, but also of power politics, in which social, economic, and religious interests competed with each other. The conflicts between secular and ecclesiastical justice had a direct impact on the population. For ordinary citizens, farmers, or craftsmen, it was often unclear which authority was responsible, what punishments were to be expected, or which laws they could invoke. This led to uncertainty and dependence on the favor of judges, officials, or church authorities. Wealthy or influential citizens had better opportunities to use the conflicts to their advantage, while the poor were often crushed between responsibilities.
Despite the conflicts, a pragmatic approach to the overlap of responsibilities developed in the course of the Middle Ages. Agreements, written protocols, appointment procedures, and coordination between secular and ecclesiastical authorities helped to limit the conflicts. These mechanisms showed that medieval justice was based not only on strict legality, but also on pragmatic coordination, social control, and balance of power. Overall, the competition between secular and ecclesiastical justice illustrates the complexity of the medieval legal system. It was an expression of a dual structure of authority, in which law, religion, and power were inextricably linked. Conflicts arose not only from different legal bases, but also from the need to enforce social order, political stability, and moral norms at the same time. The population was directly affected by this, and the judiciary was at the same time an instrument of control, power projection, and social regulation.
Chapter 20. The Legacy of Medieval Court Trials and Their Impact on Posterity. The medieval trials left a lasting legacy that went far beyond the specific procedures, punishments, or institutional specificities. They shaped the relationship between law, power, and society and influenced the development of justice systems in Europe over centuries. Despite the often arbitrary, brutal, or unequal treatment of the accused, these trials were an important part of the social order, the exercise of political power, and moral regulation. They created structures, principles, and practices that, in a modified form, formed the basis for later legal developments. One of the central legacies is the combination of law and social control. Medieval court trials were not only legal processes, but also means of making norms, hierarchies, and authority visible. They demonstrated which behaviors were considered correct or deviant, what penalties were threatened, and how power was exercised. This principle was continued in later legal systems, albeit in a more formal and rational way. The idea that law not only sanctions individual guilt but ensures the stability of the community is a direct legacy of medieval practice. Another legacy concerns the institutional development of the judiciary. The structure of local, municipal, territorial, and ecclesiastical courts that emerged in the Middle Ages laid the foundation for hierarchical court systems that were later standardized in Europe. Appeal procedures, the recording of witnesses, the recording of statements, and the organization of court proceedings developed from medieval customs into central elements of modern justice. The idea that higher courts can review decisions is also based on the experience and necessities of medieval jurisdiction. The medieval trials also left behind a rich legacy of legal theory and practice. Canon law, customary law, and local customs were documented, interpreted, and further developed. These traditions influenced legal scholarship, the emergence of legal codes, and the development of legal principles such as the meaning of witness statements, oaths, or evidence. Even the rigorous application of punishment and the idea that justice must be publicly demonstrated can be found in a modified form in later legal systems, albeit more humane and formally regulated. A particularly formative aspect was the link between law and religion. Church jurisdiction shaped the understanding of morality, guilt, and atonement, and also influenced secular jurisprudence. The practice of including ethical, moral, and spiritual dimensions in legal proceedings is still evident in the later development of norms that emphasize responsibility, repentance, and reparation. The Middle Ages taught that law can not only be abstract rules, but must always be interpreted in a social, moral, and cultural context. The trials also had long-term social effects. They established norms for interaction between individuals, between citizens and rulers, between nobility, bourgeoisie, and clergy. They demonstrated power and hierarchy and helped to stabilize social structures. At the same time, they created role models for public criminal practice, bureaucratic documentation, and the role of witnesses, judges, and administration. Many of these elements were adopted, adapted, and professionalized as legal systems developed in the early modern period. Last but not least, medieval processes were a mirror of human nature. It showed how fear, faith, social belonging, power, and influence determined the interpretation of law.
This complex relationship between law, power, and morality has been further developed in European legal history and has contributed to the development of a more differentiated, rational, and formally regulated system that nevertheless takes into account the social, political, and moral dimensions of law. The legacy of medieval court trials is thus not the blindness of the punishments or the harshness of the proceedings, but the creation of structures, principles, and practices that continue to have an impact today. They laid the foundations for appeals, documentation, testimony, and the hierarchy of the judiciary. And they always reminded us that law and society are inextricably linked. In this sense, the processes of the Middle Ages not only influenced the immediate population, but shaped the development of law and notions of justice over centuries, leaving behind a complex, multi-layered legacy that forms the basis of modern justice systems.